everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Keeping the Spark Alive while complying with the new financial value, transparency, and gainful employment rules. That's a mouthful this morning. So anyway, welcome to our Valentine's edition. I'm Haley Hansen. I am the leader of the higher education team here at Husch Blackwell. We want to thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to submit them via the question box. We will try to answer the questions, although I will give you the caveat that some questions may not have answers yet, but we will try to do our best to answer the questions. However, if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, we'll reach back out to you and answer the questions later via email. Also, a PDF of the presentation is available in the program materials folder at the bottom of your console as well. This program has been approved for legal education hours. Instead of reading off all the states, we will let you click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen, and you're able to report and track hours. A certificate of attendance, including the course numbers, will also be emailed to you tomorrow with a recording of the webinar for you to watch or share if anyone missed it today. Towards the end of this program, be sure to complete our short survey. We do use your feedback to plan future webinars that are applicable to your institution. That's all for the housekeeping matters, so let's get started with our program. I am so pleased to be joined by these three incredible partners of mine here at Husch Blackwell on Valentine's Day, and we all got the memo to dress appropriately for Valentine's Day. So joining me today, we have Julie Maselli, who is our office managing partner in our Chicago office. Julie has more than 20 years of education law experience. She works with both private and public colleges and universities, major research institutions, academic medical centers, just a few of those, and understands the complex compliance issues. We have the benefit that Julie did spend some time at the Department of Education as well and brings her insight from her time at the department. So very happy to have Julie joining us today. Annie Cartwright is also a partner in the education group working out of Kansas City, and she works with a variety of institutions, all national research institutions and small private institutions as well. She serves as primary outside counsel to many of our clients and has a broad range of in-depth experience regarding regulatory advising. So institutions frequently call on Annie when they have questions regarding regulatory issues, and we're so happy to have her with us today as well. And finally, we have Lisa Parker, and Lisa is also in our education office in Chicago, and she represents a full range of education institutions, including private, not-for-profit, public healthcare affiliated institutions. And she also has served as a vice president for a large publicly traded company before joining us at Husch, and has a lot of experience, not only with transactions, but also regulatory experience today. So we have a lot of knowledge here, and I couldn't be happier to be introducing my colleagues. So let's go ahead and move forward and talk about our agenda for today. So we've stayed with our theme. We're on theme today. We have channeled Jane Austen, and we are going to talk about these regulations. We're going to go through Once Upon a Time and talk a little bit about just the background. Julie and I will go over the background for you of the regulations and what they contain. A lot of this is contained within our blog post, so we're not going to spend too much time over it other than, are we ever going to truly understand the calculations? And then we're going to turn it over to Annie and Lisa, who are really going to talk about what you need to do moving forward as an institution, and how do you take these steps moving forward. I would like to say, though, as we kind of start off, that we have a wide range of attendees today. Some of you have a lot of experience, although this is all new to all of us, and some of you have very, very little experience in this area. So we're really going to try to unpack the potential implications of these new regulations, the timing, and really what it means to you. But there could be questions questions that you have that there are not answers to yet, but we'll work through that together. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie to kick us off. And it's always a good place to start, Julie, at Once Upon a Time.
Sure. Well, the once upon a time of the financial value transparency and gainful employment regulations would take far more time and be far more complicated than we have. I feel like I'd be trying to explain the romantic entanglements between days of our lives and As the World Turns if I was going to get into all of the detail, because it's a very dramatic story. So I'm just going to give a quick overview at the highest level about the rules and where they came from. So the regulations are intended to advance two underlying policy goals. One is to provide prospective students and their families with consumer-minded information about the most important financial outcomes of those individuals who complete Title IV programs. And that's so that prospective students and their families who are considering programs have information about what their outcomes may be. The second is to establish minimum eligibility thresholds relating to those financial outcomes for all non-degree programs and all programs of proprietary schools, essentially to put in an accountability framework for some of these programs such that Title IV aid could potentially be lost. It's important to start with those underlying principles so that we understand what the department's trying to do as we dig into these very complex and detailed regulations. The once upon a time part of this story also needs to focus on where these rules came from. And while they're all new to us, they're going to apply in some way to all institutions of higher education that participate in Title IV. And they represent the goals from a policy perspective of both the Biden administration, but also the Obama administration. These rules, while new, have actually been in the works since 2009 in some form. We could not name, just as we could not name all of Victor Newman's wives on this webinar, for those of you who may be young in the Restless fans, we could not cover the various iterations of all of the predecessor rules that gave rise to the rules that we're going to be talking about today. We couldn't talk about the dramatic pivot away from the rules in the last administration or all of the litigation that we have seen over these regulations over the last decade. So while they're new, they do come from a place of policy goals from two administrations, and we have to keep that in mind. So those are three components I'd like everybody to just keep top of mind as we dig into all of these details. One is that where prior iterations of these rules focused on programs in the for-profit sector and on non-degree programs, these new rules actually apply to all institutions in a very big way, including nonprofit schools and public schools. Two, compliance needs to start now. In order to measure these financial outcomes that we'll get into, the department's going to need a lot of data from institutions and is going to be requiring institutions to report that data soon. As you'll see from this webinar, that's comprehensive and we need to make sure schools are ready to do that. And where the sector has already argued that there should be some delay in the implementation of those reporting requirements, particularly because of the new FAFSA simplification and all of the work associated with that. In the rulemaking, the department actually said that it was unpersuaded to delay implementation of these rules, and that the department then felt that institutions would be more than ready, in fact, ready much sooner than July of 2024. And for that reason, time really is of the essence to get ready to comply. And the third sort of overarching piece of our Rapana story that to keep in mind as we dig into these requirements is that the topic is very hard. It's complex. There is ambiguity in the regulations, and dare I even say there are holes. So we will try to answer questions when they come in to the extent that there are answers. We will all be working together as a sector to try to find those unanswered questions, answers to them. So we're going to try to get through, as Haley said, a good chunk of the rules to summarize now, but then we'll be covering the practical strategies in the second part. So let me start just by getting a sense of where everyone is in their GE and their financial value transparency journey. Where are you? Have you studied the new rules in the commentary and your institution is implementing a plan to meet its obligations already? In which case, we may ask you to participate in this webinar. You have a solid understanding of these new requirements and you're ready to start an action plan with your team. Or are you, some of you out there still wrapping your heads around these new requirements and their impact on your institution, and how many of you are just starting with us for your first step? That'll give us a better sense of how to frame our conversation going forward. I'll give everybody a few more seconds to answer your poll, submit your poll questions, and I'm going to go ahead and 3, 2, 1, close the poll. Let's see where our results are. Okay, overwhelmingly, a lot of you are still wrapping your head around the general requirements and their impact on your institution. And some of you, about a third of you, are still just getting started and listening to this webinar as your first step. So for those of you who have studied them closely, you can help keep us accountable for trying to find those answers to the tough questions. For the rest of you, let's dig in on these requirements. So I'm going to get started with making sense and sensibility of these requirements. There's really two key components of the regulations, and I've heard them referred to as two rules, one rule with two components. Either way you slice or dice it, there is a financial value transparency component that is going to apply to all programs, gainful employment programs and non-gainful employment programs. And we'll discuss a little bit about that dichotomy in a moment. But this is the consumer-minded information that the department wants families and prospective students to have. It is to provide an assessment of the financial value of each Title IV program through a series of metrics. There's actually 3. 2 debt to earnings ratios, one that measures a completer's annual earnings to the debt load that they are paying, another that measures their discretionary earnings to the debt load that they are paying for that program. And then there's an earnings premium measure. We're going to unpack what each of those mean in a moment. But essentially what this is doing is providing consumer information in a variety of formats, particularly through a website that the U.S. Department of Education will be compiling, that posts all of this information so that researchers, students, prospective students, members of the media can mine that data and be more informed about their program choices. There can be some consequences for all programs, that if there are programs out there that fail to meet those metrics as defined by the department, there will be some requirements for acknowledgments for institutions to get from their students before they enroll in those failing programs. Meaning students need to be aware that they may be receiving low earnings if they complete that program. There are some exceptions to those rules, and we'll get into those as well. The second component of these rules is the gainful employment piece. And that applies only to gainful employment programs, which we'll define for you. It really is an accountability framework that will allow the department to impose eligibility restrictions on programs that fail over the course of a couple of years. So there is much more significant and severe consequence for failing these metrics if you are a GE program, because you can lose Title IV eligibility. Cascading up until that point, there will also be student warnings and acknowledgments that could be required for programs that are failing but have not yet fully failed. The covered programs, to explain a little bit about this dichotomy between non-GE programs and GE programs, I think I need to back up and talk a little bit about the Higher Education Act and how it provides eligibility for Title IV participation to certain programs. Public and nonprofit post-secondary educational institutions are able to participate in Title IV essentially by virtue under the HEA of their status. But institutions that are in the proprietary sector, whether they're offering degree or non-degree programs, are eligible to participate because it is assumed, and the Congress contemplated, that those programs would lead to gainful employment in a recognized occupation. And so that is what we define as a GE program, those programs that are participating in Title IV under that provision of the HEA. That would include all programs at a proprietary institution and all non-degree programs across the entire sector. The general principles is that all non-degree programs are supposed to lead to gainful employment or recognized occupation, and most of those programs are proprietary would do so. Those are the covered programs. The key exemptions for these new rules is that small programs are going to be excluded. And that makes sense because there could be some question about the quality of the data if you have a particularly low N size. So the department is generally not going to calculate these metrics if there is less than 30 students who complete that program for a 4-year cohort. Student is defined as a Title IV recipient, so we have to talk about a specific kind of student. For instance, that might not include international students who aren't Title IV eligible. If the program has 30 students or more in a 4-year cohort, they'll be calculated. The territories are also excluded, so institutions that are participating in Title IV in the U.S. territory or freely associated states are excluded, but they do have to provide some reporting data to the department, so they're not fully excluded. And then, of course, non-Title IV programs are also excluded from these calculations. That would be continuing education, boot camps, non-credential programs, and CTP programs that serve students with disabilities. The implementation calendar we're going to just quickly cover is important. Right now, we're moving into a period where the new rules are going to become effective July 1, 2024. But you're going to soon see how that even though they're becoming effective in July, they're going to be backward looking on data and information that you already have in your possession from prior years. The most important deadline to keep in mind after the effective date is that July 31st, 2024 is when most programs are going to need to start reporting data for certain cohorts in certain academic years. The department's going to have a look back period. It wants to look at data in prior award years, not just going forward. And that data is going to be required to be submitted to the department on July 31st, 2024. There's some reporting deadlines that will bleed into October 1st for some other programs, but generally speaking, July 31st is the date that most institutions need to keep in mind for complying with the initial reporting requirements. As a reminder, those reporting requirements give the department the data it needs to calculate these financial metrics. Then every year after, starting in 2025, we're all going to have an annual reporting requirement deadline of October 1st, where new data will be submitted to the department and eventually through a form that the department will release. It has not done so yet, but it will be releasing a form so that annually there's a structure for reporting that data on an every year rolling basis. And then there's some consequences related to GE programs that my colleagues will unpack later. The first certification for GE programs, which they will explain momentarily, will start at the end of this year, December 31st, with the first potential consequences hitting in July 1 of 2026. So that's a little bit of the schedule that's ahead for implementing these new rules. So am I going to ever understand these calculations? I referred to some of these metrics that we talked about, and it really reminds me of sort of this this quote from Pride and Prejudice. I have not the pleasure of understanding you, to which Mr. Bennett was referring to his wife and saying she was hysterical about all of the options of the suitor options for her children. And he said, I can't understand you. And that's kind of how I feel about some of these requirements. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Haley, who has some mastery over these requirements, and will walk us through them.
Thanks, Julie. I'm not sure mastery is the correct word, but we will walk through them, and then we'll get it over to Annie and Lisa shortly too, so we can really unpack this. So when we talk about the calculations, it's really important to understand the concepts that these calculations are based upon. And the most, one of the more important ones is really understanding what a completer is. And so again, for those of you who got our blog post, and you'll have copies of these slides, it's important to understand that for each relevant program, the department will compile a completers list. So the department is compiling this list, and it's based on the NSLDS enrollment data reported by institutions. Title for recipients who completed the program during the cohort period too. That is what it's looking at during the cohort period. And as you look at completers during that cohort period, excluded from those rates are these different categories. So one or more of the students' Title IV loans are under consideration or being approved for permanent disability discharge. The student enrolled in full-time and any other eligible program in which earnings are measured, whether it's at your institution or at another institution. Those are examples of things that are going to be excluded from these rates. The student is deceased. The student is enrolled in a prison education or comprehensive transition and post-secondary program. Those are areas upon which they are going to be excluded from the calculations. Once you receive this list, though, the institution will have 60 days to review the list and make corrections to the list of who should be included for the relevant completers. And I think that's important to understand, because you're going to want to make sure that you have you're aware of this, that you're looking at the list, and that you agree with the individuals on the list as well. And so here are the debt to earnings rates that will be calculated. The annual earnings rate, which is the annual loan payment, and I'll kind of break down what is included in these, divided by the median annual earnings. Again, if you have 8% plus, you're going to be considered to be a high debt burden as you're looking at these. And then the discretionary earnings rates, and this is the annual loan payment divided by the median annual earnings. Again, this talks really about how much discretionary income someone would have to be able to spend, and includes in the calculation 150% of the poverty guideline. And so again, looks at what are those programs, what are those areas that you have a high debt burden. So although they may look simple, those calculations, they have a lot to unpack within the calculation. So the annual loan payment is calculated based on the median loan debt of the completers during the applicable cohorts, again, looking at the cohort, and then amortizing the debt, which includes all of these different areas upon which they are looking at. The cap means that schools will not be charged for living expenses. And so I think that's really important that the department was willing to clarify as you look at the annual loan payment. The department, though, also declined to exclude institutional debt attributable to other programs at the same institution. And so I think that's important to understand as you're looking at the calculation of the annual loan payment. And again, looking at the capped at the lesser of the two, total debt the student incurred of the program, or the total amount of the student's tuition fees, books, equipment, supplies. All right, so let's move on to what does the median earnings mean? And this means that the department will obtain from a federal agency with earnings data. So what does that mean, you might ask? Where are they going to get this data from? And the department has not been completely clear on it. In fact, has said that it may come from the Treasury Department, including the IRS, the Social Security Administration, the SSA, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Census Bureau. And so we're still going to be looking at exactly where the median earnings data will be coming from. And again, there will be more information provided from the department, but the median annual earnings for students on the completer list, who the agency data was able to be matched with, is what they're going to be looking for. The number of students on the list that they cannot match will also does not include, again, specified students as you look at kind of what the median earnings are going to calculate. I still think, though, and Julie can give us more information on this, but from the last rounds, we simply looked at the Social Security Administration data, and now the data could come from all of these other areas, the IRS, and these different areas. So we're waiting to get more information on the median earnings. And then yet a third way to calculate all of this is the median annual earnings divided by the earnings threshold to determine low earning. And that's going to be the third way that the department can really look at these calculations. So what does the earnings threshold mean? Again, when we look at the earnings threshold, it's the median earnings for working adults and in age 25 to 34 with only a high school diploma or equivalent who have worked during the last year or indicated that they were unemployed in a state where the institution is located or nationally, if fewer than 50% of the students in the program are from a state where the institution is located. Again, this part is going to be based on Census Bureau data. All right, so what do we need to know? This is all very complicated, lots of information here that, again, Annie and Lisa are going to unpack a little bit later. We're just kind of setting the stage for this. But the reporting elements, there is a robust amount of information that you're going to have to report upon, as Julie said. And so for each program, as you look at this, and I'm not going to read this entire slide deck, but use it, you're going to have to report all of this information and gather this information for each student. And if the student completed or withdrew during the award year, you have, again, additional data that would need to be completed and provided. So there's a lot of information that you need to be appropriately set up for to be reporting out. And I think that's one of the main takeaways of this section is, number one, understanding what can be calculated. And as we were kind of preparing for this beforehand, I said something like, well, this, it seems confusing. Wouldn't it just be easier if they just said, this is the way it's going to be? And there is a level of confusion. And so that's why we think it's so important for you to collect this information as quickly as you can. And as Julie said, the department takes the position that you should already have this information and be ready to move forward, which some schools may be, and that's wonderful. And others may be looking at how they're going to collect and kind of put this information together. So with that, Julie, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about standard versus transitional reporting.
Yeah, and I know I've seen we have a lot of questions on this particular issue. Before I dive into this slide, I want to just back up and go right back to something we said at the very beginning, which is what was the underlying policy for these rules? Because Haley just walked through all these complicated metrics. It's to provide prospective students and their families with consumer-minded information so that they can use to make more informed decisions about the programs and the loans that they may be taking out for the programs that they want to complete. Those metrics are different ways of evaluating the financial outcomes for completers, for people who get through those programs, and what does their annual earnings look like? What does their discretionary income look like when you take into consideration their loan payments? That earnings premium that Haley just got at is really looking at whether or not a student is going to be doing better than an average student who has a high school diploma financially. And so those are the different ways of slicing and dicing the data to try to help put that information in the hands of consumers. So Haley just covered all the data and reporting requirements. There's program requirements, so information about your programs that needs to be provided. There's information about your completers that will need to be provided. And there's a ramp-up period. The department has said that it will provide a form starting by July 1 of 2026 for which you'll submit this data on an annual basis. In the meantime, the department is actually asking not just let's get started, but let's get started and look back at a period of time of your completers in your Title IV programs. And for most schools, they may be looking at, well, let's just provide what we have. And that would be the standard reporting method. And the department is saying, well, for 6 years, looking back 2017 to 2018, so that award year period, all the way through 2022 to 23, which is 6 award years, please provide all of that data. And then we'll use that data about your completers against the earnings data that we have to compare for each of those metrics. But it does recognize that some schools may not even retain that data long enough to go back that period of time. So it offers a transitional reporting period. And this is what I saw a lot of the comments is, well, isn't there an option for me to do this ramp up through a shorter period of time? And there is. Annie and Lisa are going to talk a little bit about the sort of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these options. But the transitional reporting period, just so everybody's clear, would only have institutions go back 2 years and report their information for programs and for students for 2022, 2023, and the prior, most recently completed award year. And then the department will use that information against the earnings data that it's able to get that is 6 years old. So you'll have older earnings data against newer information that you're reporting about your programs and program costs. So there is a second method. Again, Annie and Lisa are going to talk a little bit about the strategies to be thinking about it as to whether or not you want to take advantage of that transitional reporting requirement. Haley mentioned, and I want to cover again, this piece on the cohort period. The department's not going to look at every program in 1 year snapshots, really because the data, frankly, may be too minimal. You may have less than 30 completers in a year. You may have less than 30 completers in a 2 year period. So it's evaluating these metrics based on 2 year cohort. If 30 or more students completed the period, so that 2 year period. And that would apply to the third and fourth award years that it's evaluating prior to the most recent earnings data that they have available. If you have too small of a cohort in that 2 year, they want to look at 4 years. And so if the program has fewer than 30 students during the 2 year cohort, and 30 plus students completed during the 4 year cohort, it's going to evaluate that. There is an exception for a longer period look back or a broader period look back for qualifying graduate programs. And I want to unpack this because I saw some questions already in the chat. Specified healthcare and counseling programs, and that's going to include medicine, osteopathy, dentistry, clinical psychology, marriage and family counseling, clinical social work programs, and clinical counseling. A lot of these programs have what is a postgraduate training requirement that would give rise to potentially no or less earnings than a completer might expect several years out after that postgraduate training. The department recognized that could potentially distort earnings data for those particular programs, and in a negative way, to the detriment of the institution. So they're providing longer look backs. So they're going to look at a 2 year cohort for students who completed in the 6th and 7th award year, and a 4 year cohort for students who completed in 6th, 7th, and 8th and 9th award years prior to the most recent data. That's to try to level up what these qualifying graduate programs, the reality on the ground of what earnings might look like for a completer of that program. And the department's also specified that it may supplement this list in time, so that if there's other programs sort of naturally have this postgraduate training component, they don't want to inadvertently distort that data, and they may provide some exceptions. The debt to earnings and the earnings premium measures in the cohort for 2024-25 is this, and I think this is an important place to start if you're still trying to unpack how this works, is that for this next award year, we're going to be looking for a 2 year cohort period is 2017 and 18 and 18 and 19. And that 4 year cohort is from 2015-16 award year all the way through 2018-2019 award year. Once the department calculates this information, it's going to be issuing a notice of determination. And that would be for each award year in which the department calculates the rates, the debt to earnings and the earnings premium measure. And for each program, it would inform the institution for each of its program what the rates were, what the earning premium measure was, and whether or not that program is passing or failing, and if there would be any consequences. The regulations outline what those consequences are, so we wouldn't, I would hope we wouldn't see a surprise in a notice of determination, and instead we'd be rooted in what the rules require. And that generally is a student acknowledgement for programs if the program is failing. But for GE programs, the notice of determination will include additional information, whether, for instance, a consequence of a student warning is required for students who are already enrolled, whether the program could become ineligible based on the next year's calculation for the debt to earning rate or earnings premium measure. Essentially trying to let institutions know that it has a vulnerable program, that if the rates come in, it could be losing Title IV eligibility. The department's also explained that it's going to have a program information website where it's going to post a lot of basic information about every program. That would be the length, the enrollment, the cost, including tuition fees, books, supplies, equipment. But then also these metrics, along with medians of total cost of tuition, program or institutions full-time and less than full-time completion and withdrawal rates, median loan debt of students who completed, withdrew, whether graduates are required to complete a post-grad training program prior to obtaining a license, if that is required to work in the state, primary occupations that a program generally prepares the students to enter, if the program has accreditation programmatically, what those measures are, and also the loan repayment rates. Essentially, this is looking to be a one-stop shop, if what the department put in its rules rings true, for a lot of consumer information. A lot of comparison shopping will likely be facilitated by a website like this. And then, of course, the department will require the institution to also reference these where this information lives on the department's website. So there are other Title IV requirements that require prominent links to access specific information that the department feels is important for students and borrowers to know. And this has a component to that too. Institutions are going to have to provide access and links to the department's website to a student before they sign an enrollment agreement, before they complete registration, before they make a financial commitment. And even for enrolled students, when this gets started, they're going to have to go back and make sure they're fully notified as well prior to the first payment period in the next award year. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Lisa to talk a little bit more about what happens to these programs that might fail the calculations.
Thanks, Julie. So hello, everyone, and we're now moving on to pride and prejudice against institutions that fail the calculations. And so Haley and Julie have described the calculations and what's involved in terms of reporting, but I'm going to talk a little bit now about what we know about the actual impact of these regulations. So to start, talking about what are the non-gainful employment programs. So these are your degree programs at your public institutions and your nonprofit institutions. And so when the department was coming up with the gainful employment rule, the proposed and then the final rule, as part of that process, they ran a data set to get a sense of how these rules will actually create an impact. And so they used a data set of programs that were from 2022, active programs, and they looked at those programs and ran the numbers. And so what they did was, for the debt to earnings ratio, they looked at data from 2015-16 and 2016-17. And then for the earnings premium rate, they looked at data from 2014-2015 and 2015-2016. And I mentioned those time periods because I think it's important for us to recognize that when the department is running these calculations, we're talking about data that is old. This is not recent data. That's the basis of the calculations. And so using that data set, they concluded that for those 2022 programs, 842 degree programs at public institutions would fail, and 640 at nonprofit institutions would fail. So that's a lot of programs. They also excluded from that calculation 87% of the programs that were even during that time period because they didn't have enough completers. And so that is just an example of what we're talking about and why this is such an important topic for your institution to really grapple with, because we're talking about a lot of programs that will fail these metrics. Importantly, one of the things, and I've seen it in the comments, that folks are focused on are the graduate programs at the public and nonprofit institutions. This has been a focus of the department. And when they ran this data set, they highlighted that in the graduate programs, we're looking at, for example, law school, 29% of students enrolled in law schools in 2022 are in failing programs. And for theology, it's 25% of enrollment, and for health, 19% of enrollment. And I've included the sites so you can look back at the rule where the department talks about this data. But those are really big numbers. So what does it mean if you have a non-GE program that fails? What are the consequences of that? So again, if we're talking about a public or a nonprofit institution, your undergraduate degree program. For undergraduate degree programs there are no direct consequences. And by that, we mean there is nothing that you as an institution are required to do aside from the reporting that Julie and Haley just talked about. But the department will have this website that Julie was just mentioning that will list the program as either low earning or a high debt burden program. So folks will be able to see that program when they're considering enrollment. If you have a graduate program at either a public or a nonprofit institution and it fails, you will be required to have a student acknowledgement. So as of July 1, 2026, if you have a graduate program that fails the debt to earning rate, and just the debt to earning rate, we're not talking about the earning premium for these graduate programs, but fails the debt to earning rate, then you will need to provide an acknowledgement from prospective students. So what that means is that before you can enroll a student, a prospective student in your graduate program, that student, you'll have to direct them to go to the department's website, and they will need to go to your program and complete an acknowledgement on the department's site indicating that they know that your program has failed. And so that is what the consequence will be for graduate programs that are non-GE programs. And you will have to do those student acknowledgements until either the program passes the debt to earning rate or until 3 years have passed since you've been notified that you failed. So then now talking about the gainful employment programs. So gainful employment programs, again, are the programs at your public and nonprofit institutions that are non-degree programs. So we're talking about certificate programs. And for proprietary institutions, we're talking about all of your programs. And so when the department, again, looking at this 2022 data set, when they looked at that, they found that about 1,700 G programs that enroll nearly 700,000 students were going to fail at least one of these tests. In looking at those, they saw major issues with culinary services programs. 73% of those certificate programs, 73% of students, I should say, enrolled in those programs were going to be in failing programs, and about a third of students enrolled in medical assisting programs were going to be in failing programs. So for these GE programs, there are a variety of consequences. The first is the minute that your program fails, the year that you find out that you fail, as of July 1, 2026, you're going to have to issue a student warning if it's either the failure of the debt to earning or the earnings premium. And so this warning is going to have to really advise students, what does this mean for them? So you'll have to tell them that the program failed, but you'll also need to tell them whether or not you have another program they could potentially transfer into because this program is failing. You'll have to tell them whether you'll continue to offer the program, even if it, let's say, loses Title IV eligibility. You'll have to tell them whether or not you think that their credits will transfer based on a program that is failing. And you'll have to tell them whether or not you will offer them a refund if the program loses eligibility. So there's a lot of things that go into that warning. And then you have to give them 3 business days after the warning before you can enroll them, register them, or disperse any of their Title IV funds. In addition to that, you have to make sure that your prospective students, as well as current students for a program that fails, again, goes to the department website and they have to submit that acknowledgement that they know that it's a failing program. So that's the warning requirement. Then your program could lose Title IV eligibility, and that would be if it fails either the debt to earning or the premium, metric within 2 out of any 3 consecutive award years, it would lose eligibility. And that period of ineligibility will last for 3 years. And that's ineligibility for the program that's failing, as well as establishing any substantially similar program. And the department, of course, bases this on these zip codes. And also, let's say that you decided you want to be proactive and voluntarily discontinue a program once you learn that it's failing. If you decide to do that, you still are unable to restart that program for 3 years or a substantially similar program for 3 years. So there are some major consequences from these rules. Lastly, you might be thinking, okay, well, what if this happens? Can I appeal? What can I do? The appeal measures are really not great. There is no ability right now based on the rules to challenge any of the earning figures or to correct data errors. That was something in the old rule. You had the ability to show different alternatives. For example, you might be tracking your graduates and you might know that they're earning more than what the department's data shows. This new rule does not give you that ability to sort of show these alternative earnings. And also the appeal rate is really limited. You can only appeal after you've lost eligibility and only if the department actually issues a termination action for your program, as opposed to, let's say, it just removing it from eligibility from your e-car. And again, you can only appeal if you are appealing saying that the department has somehow miscalculated, they've done the math wrong. So the chances to appeal are very limited. So with all of those things in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Annie Cartwright to really talk about and give her impressions on what can we do in terms of your campus to help deal with this regulation, which is very serious.
Thank you, Lisa. It is serious, and I'm going to pause for a second and answer a couple of sets of questions to the extent we have answers. The first one, and since it's Valentine's Day, I say this with love for anyone who might be missing attending from the department. The first question we're getting is, when will the department be providing us with this information? And the best answer I can give you is probably sometime after you get this year's FAFSA data for your current applicants. The department has not given us any firm deadlines on when it's going to start giving us information back, but we do know that our first reporting deadline is July 31st. So we will probably start getting completer lists after that. And hopefully in the interim, we'll get some more concise guidance on some of these questions that you're asking. And the other set of questions we're getting are about multiple programs. For example, if you have an embedded certificate program, which program do you report on? And it's a little unclear because these regulations seem to have been written, as many NPRM regulations are, by committee. So they don't fit together completely, but it looks like if you have an embedded certificate program, your student is either going to still be at your school or they will be enrolled at another school, and you will be reporting on the higher credential if they stay enrolled. And then the other questions we've gotten are about graduate programs. They are included at nonprofits, and you would have to report on them. And then we also have gotten some questions on withdrawn students. Remember that you have reporting obligations with regard to withdrawn students, but the department is only going to be calculating these metrics based on your completers. So I hope that's helpful. There are still some questions in this area. And turning to love and friendship, because that's what today is all about. We are all, as your council and you as institutions, are going to come together as a team to try to solve some of these issues. And to do that, you really do need to assemble a team. Leadership buy-in is critical. Make sure your people have the bandwidth and the resources to pull this information together. Please don't just tell your financial aid director that they have to figure it out on top of the 6 other hats that they're already wearing. I suggest that you pull together a team, and they'll have different roles at different parts of the process, which of course involve the financial aid team, but also enrollment management. At some point, you're going to need IT. You'll definitely need finance. You might need alumni relations and career services and communications, your registrar's office, and you're going to need your academics as you start to make some of these tough decisions going forward. The earlier you start, another question we've gotten is, so do we just sit around and wait for the completer list from the department? Our answer to that would be no. The earlier you start, the more on top of this you're going to be. And then next, you are going to need to report. So you're going to need to gather a bunch of data. You also may have programs that are going to fail these rates. And so while you're gathering data, we recommend that to the extent we can, we go ahead and try to pull together this data so we can run some preliminary estimates of your debt to earnings rates and your EP measures. So at the program level, you're going to figure out which programs are covered here. Those are going to be your Title IV programs. If they don't take Title IV, they're not eligible for Title IV. They're not a part of these FVT and gainful employment rules. If they're under the same institutional ID, then they're all going to be considered part of your institution. Some of you might have subsidiaries with a different OPE ID. Those would be reported separately. Remember, the department is going to exclude small programs. And here's another area where we've seen questions. If you have, I'm sorry, I don't remember whether it's 30 or more or 30 or fewer, but if you don't have 30 completers in 2 years, then the department looks at a 4-year cohort. And if you don't have 30 completers in that 4-year cohort, it's not going to calculate the rate. So it's not just 30 in 2 years. You've got to look at whether you've got 30 in 4 years to decide whether your rates are going to be calculated. Then you want to consider your SIP codes and the credential level. That's how the department is loosely defining programs for purposes of these regulations. It's the 6-digit SIP code. Keep in mind that if you're not in the financial aid office, you might be thinking, well, we have 3 different accounting programs, but they're all different because they have different concentrations. Keep in mind the department might treat those all as the same if they have the same SIP codes. So you'll need to take a look at that. And there's a bunch of other program reporting data that you'll need to compile, which is mentioned on the prior slide. You'll need to report student level data. Note that there are some exceptions in the regulation, but generally students are defined as Title IV recipients. For example, the department doesn't have authority to pull the earnings data of non-Title IV recipients. So your completer list is going to be Title IV recipients, but there are a couple of places, for example, at the program level where you have to report on all students in the program, whether or not they receive Title IV. You're going to put together your completer list. The department will draw that from your NSLDS data. Again, they'll give you a chance to review it and pull the different reporting elements on them, including their program cost elements. I think those are going to be super important and suggest you start doing that pretty quickly, and their institutional grants and scholarships. We will not have completer income data from this unspecified agency, but there are some proxies you can use. We have the PPD data that is published with the final rule that the department used. That's from 2022. So considering that we're getting our first set of rates in a couple of years, it's not the worst thing you can use. At least it's post-COVID, unlike a lot of the data that you will be pulling together for the department. And then look at, maybe Bureau of Labor Statistics or your state employment agency data. And you might institutionally, if you're really persistent and really careful, you might actually have your own data about your graduate income. And then we're going to look at completer debt. I will spare you the very complicated math that goes into figuring their debt. But keep in mind, it is student debt. It's not parent debt. And the department will look at, it caps the amount of student debt it will consider at your program costs, at either the student's cost of attendance or what you actually charge the student. So that may be, since that's the max, that's your worst case scenario, that may be better data to rely on than their student debt. But there are ways you can attempt to calculate their student debt. And then look at relevant high school graduate income. Again, you can use the PPD for that. It's for working adults ages 25 to 34. They're going to be compared to your completers. The PPD data used a number that was roughly $25,000 a year to determine the median debt of people who only completed high school. And then we're going to talk about reporting. What periods do you have to report on? We got a lot of questions about transitional versus standard reporting. So I'm going to break this down a little bit. I think this is due July 31st. I've had some people say there's an argument that if you are reporting under transitional reporting, that you don't have to report until October 1st, because October 1st is the day that going forward you will use for your most recently completed year. I think the department would seem to reject that in the comments, but let's say it's still open for discussion, but I would prepare to report on July 31st, regardless of whether you're doing standard or traditional. Pros and cons of standard versus traditional. So if you're doing the standard reporting, you're going back many years. You are looking at, you might have the benefit of doing that is that you might have been a lot cheaper several years ago. And so the data may impact your calculations if you reach back further and you have lower costs during that time. The cons are that you've got a higher reporting burden. You've got to gather a lot more years of information. You might not have the data. I mean, just under your standard document destruction policies, you may not be able to reach back that far. The department recognized that, which is why it gave us the transitional option. We certainly can't impact costs or earnings data from several years ago. And once we start with the standard reporting, we can't switch to transitional. The transitional option applies for the first 6 years in which the department calculates the rates, and it only draws on the last 2 years. So that'd be academic years ending in 23 and 24. The downside of that is that your programs might be more expensive now than they were several years ago, and so that's going to impact your data and your rates. The pros are basically the opposite of standard. It's a much lower reporting threshold. You're going to have the documents at hand. Maybe you've done things in the last few years. I mean, it's post-COVID. And so maybe the COVID upset led you to refine your programs in a way that is much more career driven and you might have better outcomes. And then also, we're only reporting on 2 years. So there's no potential for your cohort here. And you may be more likely to have a number of programs whose metrics aren't calculated at all because you don't reach 30 completers. GE certification, we want to make sure that we update that. There are some new additions to what we need to report on our Gainful programs. They should already be probably on your eligibility certification and approval report and approved by your accreditors, or if you're a vocational program, by your state. But the department has added some new elements that you need to report in addition to what you're already reporting: eligibility, program name, zip code. Now you also need to report credential level, because that's how the department's going to define programs for these rules, approvals, and any updates that may make your existing certification inaccurate. Note that if you have a program that becomes ineligible, you can't add it back for 3 years, and you can't add substantially similar programs of the same zip code and credential level until your 3-year period of ineligibility is covered. Then you want to run your ratios. Again, I will spare you the math, but I recommend that you do that so that you can identify those at risk and consider what you're going to do with them. And next, our data is set in stone. It exists. We really can't do anything about it. It's already out there, although the department hasn't really identified all of it. And it goes as far back as 2016. You should be able to run these rates. If you identify at-risk programs, they'll likely still be at risk in 2 years because we're reaching so far back with some of this data. The department has repeatedly emphasized that simply complying with the financial value transparency and gainful employment rules, I'm going to quote, does not mitigate the institution's responsibility to provide accurate information to students concerning program status, nor will it be considered as dispositive evidence against a student's claim if applying for a loan discharge. So if you know now that a program is going to fail, consider how you need to address that in your program development, in your enrollment, and your communications to students. Of course, once the department starts launching this data, you're going to need to provide appropriate information, including acknowledgments and warnings to students. Make sure that you prepare for that with your communications team. And finally, you might have a sympathetic audience among your presenters. Consider whether you have, consider whether you have a place to go in terms of government relations or potentially litigation. I know there is at least one lawsuit out there. I think it's very early in the stages from an important trade industry group, but different groups have different perspectives to offer, and I expect we'll see some additional litigation in this area. And then last but not least, going forward, as we move into years where we can actually impact the data, let's do the hard things. Take a careful look at your programs. Are there things you can do to boost employment, even though employment isn't always the end goal of your programs, or certainly not high income employment? Take a look at whether you can revise your programs, add career services. Are there cost-cutting measures that we can take to impact your metrics going forward? Be an innovator in the area of debt reduction. Try to get creative. Some schools are looking at debt repayment programs where they might be able to crowdfund a donor. Those schools are lucky, and I realize they'll be few and far between probably, but consider whether you can initiate a loan payoff program. Are you an appropriate school that might want to try to become a work college? Do you have opportunities for employer partnerships or added institutional scholarships for these challenged programs where you might be able to make up for some of the challenges? And then consider whether embracing failure is an option. If you are a theology program, if you are a graduate program in the arts, if you are a social work program, your students may not be attending your institution because they expect to make a lot of money. They may be attending it because it is the best institution for theology or art or social work, and they realize they're going to come out and they're not going to make a lot of money. So these metrics may not mean all that much to them. If you can distinguish yourself from other programs that are also going to fail, consider looking forward to that and looking forward to those communication plans. Also, consider distinguishing yourself. If you are a program like law, where a lot of people come out and they go right into public interest, and then they later go into higher paying jobs, you can start talking about that with your communities. And then finally, you might have to make some hard choices. You might have programs that are going to fail, and you might decide that you need to cut them. So speaking of sort of big picture issues, needing to cut programs and those very complicated issues, we've seen a lot of schools struggling in this area recently. I know Haley has more than the rest of us, so I will let her speak to that for a moment.
Thanks, Annie. So, we have a duty of candor, really, as attorneys. And so the truth is that these regulations are really going to significantly impact a lot of institutions. Many institutions are already struggling financially. COVID's has impacted these institutions. And then you have, starting in 2025, the enrollment cliff that everyone is talking so much about impacting the institutions. So it's time to take a hard look at where you stand financially and make some plans, and that your boards need to be aware of what your financial outlook is and whether or not you need to make decisions. The Chronicle of Higher Education predicts that from 2025 to 2032, I believe, that there'll be almost 1,500 institutions of higher education that will either merge or close as a result of all of these factors that are coming into play. So it is difficult, and it's time to really realistically face what some of these options look like and talk about them now versus when it's too late. So we've had some schools that haven't been talking about these, and then they have to close within, a school that's been open for over 100 years had to close within 6 weeks because they've run out of money. So very difficult things to do, but it's time to look at those issues. Annie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Haley. I'll just close us out. The bottom line is keep trying to understand the implications of these regulations on your institution. Develop your team, develop your strategy, and it is Valentine's Day, so let's hope for positive things. Let's hope the department gives us some clear guidance, considers delays, especially in light of its own delays recently, and that we all have a happy ending in the long run. One point of clarification: we had a mix-up with our slides, and I apologize if you're seeing something different than we are. The first reporting deadline is July 31st. It is not July 1st, so I apologize if that was on the slides or if any of us misspoke and said July 1st was the first reporting deadline. It's July 31st. So you have a whole 30 days if your year ends on June 30th to get your 2023-24 data in. And then last but not least, we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge our entire education team, which is more than 4 lawyers. But really importantly, there are 3 who've been deep in the weeds, sometimes in tears with us, over these regulations over the last few months. And that is Abby Felter, Lisa Hoskins, and Ryan Spraker. We could not do this without you, and we would be remiss without sending you some Valentine's Day gratitude. Finally, we have some closeout information. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is such a hard topic, and I applaud you for digging in, whether this is your 5th webinar or your first webinar. We hope the information we've been providing is helpful. This program has been approved for legal education continuing hours. To report your hours, click the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance and a recording of the webinar will be provided to you tomorrow. And please be sure to complete our short survey. We really do take your questions and your survey responses to heart, and hope to use it to provide quality programming going forward. Thanks so much.